So let's think about where we've been. We've talked about some of the components of vulnerability. We talked about exposure. We talked about sensitivity. And we discussed how that gives us an idea of potential vulnerability, right? So now what we got to do is the thing that people don't do enough of, and that's think about adaptive capacity, because the potential vulnerability can be ameliorated by adaptive capacity. And I want you to remember we're talking about intrinsic things, things inside the organism, but we're also talking about extrinsic things, and that can include things like whether or not we have management options, whether or not we have institutions that can help us with policy, with planning, things of that nature. There are cultural aspects to adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity can be sort of complex. So what we want to do today is review the concept of adaptive capacity. We want to talk about why it matters, and then we want to understand some of the factors influencing adaptive capacity in species and habitats. But if you are working on more social or human institutions, be aware that adaptive capacity is part of those institutions as well. So of course we're going to start with definitions. The one we typically use is from the IPCC, the potential, capability, or ability of a system to adjust to climate change, to moderate potential damages, to take advantage of opportunities, or to cope with consequences. The other two definitions draw on some other ideas, but they all center around that sort of basic concept. So adaptive capacity, as it's applied to living ecological systems, is determined by things like genetic diversity, the behavioral plasticity of the organisms within that ecological system. The amount of biodiversity in a system can be important to determining the adaptive capacity of an ecosystem. Then there's also the heterogeneity of the physiographic mosaic within which the system exists. So if you have complex habitat, a lot of relief, just a complicated landscape, that can also often impart adaptive capacity. As applied to human social systems, the adaptive capacity is determined by things like the ability of institutions and networks to learn and to store knowledge and experience. There's also creative flexibility in decision making and problem solving, and the existence of power structures that are responsive and consider the needs of all stakeholders. So what I want you to remember is that adaptive capacity confers resilience to perturbation. Those perturbations can be climate change or otherwise. This gives ecological and human social systems the ability to reconfigure themselves with hopefully a minimal loss of function. So let's talk a little bit about different kinds of adaptive capacity in species. So one thing we think about is phenotypic plasticity, the sort of outward expression of the organism. And we see that in, for example, things like grasshoppers, which the same species will have a very different phenotype depending on whether or not you grow it in very crowded or not so crowded condition. You get these sorts of banding patterns. Then there's evolutionary potential, right? There's a lot of genes in organisms that aren't expressed in the habitats you see them. There's also the ability for new characteristics to arise. So there's a lot of evolutionary potential that we don't know about in species. This is why sometimes things adapt much quicker than we expect. Then there's things like behavioral plasticity. So we see this in things like cold water fish, where when it gets warm, the fish will look for a pool or some other thermal refuge and move to that habitat to avoid the conditions the unfavorable conditions they're in. There's also behavioral plasticities like a change in the timing of flowering, and other phenologies. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then there's the dispersal abilities of species. So if you're in a particularly cruddy habitat, really affected by climate change, if you can get up and move, sometimes that's exactly what happens. So the dispersal abilities of different organisms differs greatly. So some plants, they can't go very far very quickly. Other things like birds can move fairly readily. So the dispersal ability inherent to an organism is also an important adaptive capacity. So we're going to talk a little bit about this place. About 150, 160 years ago, I guess now, Thoreau spent a lot of time at Walden Pond, and so he was writing and thinking and doing a lot of other things. One of the things that he was doing was keeping fairly copious notes about the flowering of plants at Walden Pond. And so we have a record, and we can go back and look at temperature records and you know how the seasons were at that time. So we have a good record of past phenology. So some researchers thought that they would look and see how flowering and other phenological events have changed since that time. So we have this really nice record of 150, 160 years ago, and the time that this was collected, I think, was about 2007. And what we found is that flowering has advanced by up to 2 weeks in some cases. And this area has actually experienced a fair amount of climate change. Approximately 2.4 degrees Celsius, which is about 4.3 American degrees. So that's a lot of climate change. Now, it's not all climate change caused by buildup of greenhouse gases. There's also the development in the area causing heat island effect. But it's still a lot of climate change, and it gives us a glimpse into what we might expect in other places. So we found these two species. We found that some species advance their blooming by up to 2 weeks. Others hasn't changed at all. Now, what has happened is that those species that are advancing the timing of their flowering are doing just fine, whereas those that haven't are in decline. So what we see is that there are both winners and losers. And this differential effect in phenology is something that we're going to have to think about when we think about climate change. So in terms of evolution, we don't necessarily think that vertebrates evolve sort of really, really fast, and the climate change that we've seen thus far is, in an evolutionary standpoint, it's relatively quick. So some researchers in Canada found that red squirrels had advanced the timing of their first litter. So they were having young sooner. And initially, they thought that maybe this was just sort of a behavioral plasticity. But they did a genetic pedigree analysis, and they found that there was actually a genetic component to that advancing. So we do see some changes in selection and some evolutionary changes, even in relatively short periods of time. I think Kyle might have talked about this a little bit yesterday. Following the last period of glaciation, as glaciers retreated, we saw things like the tree species also dispersing. And so over a couple thousand years, oak trees were able to move northward. So even relatively fixed species can disperse at a rate of, in this case, about 200 to 400 meters per year. And then, of course, we see things like, coming from the Christmas bird surveys, things like black turnstones, green-winged teals, and the pine siskin moving anywhere from 150 to almost 300 miles northward. Now, a word of caution with these data, it's sort of easy to find something way outside its range. The bird folks love that. And what these data represent are the most northern extent of an individual. What we're really more interested in as biologists is sort of where the center of the population is moving and where they're sort of really taking up residence. Some of these may be vagrants, but it's still significant data. This slide, what I want you to remember is that while some species expand their range under climate change, right? So they go from a point southward and simply expand their range as the climate changes. What we'll probably see with other species is simply a contraction of their range. Okay, so here, what we see with the oaks is that they're from the south, they're moving northward. With spruce, we see a different pattern where it's simply a contraction of the habitat. I want you to think a little bit about the adaptive capacity of communities. So communities are a little bit different because we're talking about potentially a whole lot of species in a given place. And with communities, if we have a lot of functional diversity, we sort of don't worry as much about losing a species or two. It's not something we want, but we know where we have a lot of functional redundancy, we have adaptive capacity. Other areas like salt marshes, which are dominated often by just a couple of species, we're a lot more concerned about because one species can strongly structure that entire community. And so we need to think about what that one species is doing because that will structure what it looks like in the future. In those cases, we consider these very simple systems to have less adaptive capacity where they don't have a lot of functional redundancy. We talked a little bit about intrinsic versus extrinsic factors. We talked about the intrinsic ability of organisms to move, right? They can run, walk, fly, whatever. But we can also think about the ability of an organism to move across a landscape and the extrinsic adaptive capacity of that landscape. So in a place where we have a lot of roads, or in a river where we have dams, or other places, we need to think about whether or not there's barriers to that movement. And so where we have highly fragmented habitats that lack hubs and corridors to move through, we would say that that's probably got a relatively low adaptive capacity. But that gives us an idea of how we can develop management scenarios to promote adaptive capacity, right? We can look to a model that preserves hubs and corridors for species to move through. We might not know exactly what's going to move through it, but it's one of the management plans that we can take in light of uncertainty. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. Extrinsic adaptive capacity also includes things like management potential, where the fire regime has changed, we can try to manage fire. There are species that are easy to move, and if we can translocate a species, controversy aside, then we consider it to have more adaptive capacity. So I want you to think a lot about what the management potential of the species or the systems are that you're interested in, and think about adaptive capacity.